So once we have put the file in the S3 bucket, there are a couple of other things that I'm going to do. The first one being the file name and the initial word count would be stored in a MongoLab MongoDB account. And the second thing is that we will delete the local file that we had uploaded earlier. So once we resize the file, we put it in the bucket, there is no need for the local file and we should delete that. So the very first thing that we need to do is we will go to the MongoLab account that we had earlier used in the ChatCat example. And very quickly, I'm going to create a new database here. And let's pick up a single node development and a sandbox account like before. Let's call this photo grid. And click on the create new MongoDB deployment. And once the photo grid database has been deployed, let's go inside the database. And let's create a user. So let's click on this link here. And I'm going to create a user called photo grid with the password my photo grid. And let's click on create. So if you remember the sequence of steps that we followed in the ChatCat example, what we next need to do is copy this URL, and inside our development.json and the production.json, we need to create a new key called db_url, and we will set this to this URL and simply change the user to whatever you create. In this case, I've created the username called photogrid with a password called my photogrid. So make sure you spell that correctly. And we are also going to copy this thing into the production.json because this will remain the same. Next, we need to install Mongoose. Require mongoose.connect, and we want to connect to the config.db URL. Let's install Mongoose. So npm install mongoose --save. There. So once Mongoose is installed, like always, provide a reference to the routes.js function that we have. So Mongoose goes here in the routes.js. Like so. Now, before you actually store something in the MongoDB database, what you'll need to do is create a Mongoose schema. So let's do that. I'm going to create a variable called single image, and let's set this to new mongoose.schema, and the schema simply would be the file name, which would be a string, followed by the number of votes that the image gets, and this will be of the type number. Once you have the Mongoose schema, let's turn this into a model. Let's call this as single image model, and we'll set this to mongoose.model single image, and we'll point to the single image schema that we had created earlier. So next, scroll down to the point where we have received the status code of 200, indicating a successful storage of the file in the S3 bucket. At this point in time, what I need to do is create a new variable called new image, because we want to store the reference to this image inside our MongoLab account. Set this to new single image model, and we want to provide the file name, which in this case will not be n file, but it will be f name. So f name stands for just the file name and not the complete path. We don't require the complete path. So provide this, and followed by a word count or words set to 0. So we're going to start with 0 words. Append or pipe in a save to ensure that this record gets saved into the MongoLab account. Once you've done that, the next thing to do is to signal the front end that the file has been successfully saved, so that the user gets a feedback on the user interface. So remember, in the PhotoGrid utils file, we have provided you with a show status function, and what this does is it simply displays a message for a predefined number of milliseconds on the user interface. And what we need to do is we need to invoke this method by first signaling the front end using socket.io. So let's do that. I'm going to go into the app.js first, and we're going to provide reference to the IO over here. And since the variables are declared afterwards, let's just copy these two and put them here, because only when the variable is defined can it be accessed by the routes.js. So this tiny change needs to be done. In the routes.js, let's call IO in, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called socket with a capital S, and we'll say IO on connection. In the callback function, get a reference to the socket that is created, and set the variable socket with the capital S to the socket that is returned by the socket.io. This way you would be able to use the socket outside of the IO connection event listener. So once this is done, let's scroll back to the point where we just saved our record in the MongoLab account, and we're just going to signal the front end by invoking socket with the capital S dot emit, and we want to emit a status with the message set to saved. So that's the message that will be displayed on the web page, on the index.html page. And we also have a provision of providing a delay. This is the number of milliseconds for which the status message would be displayed on the screen before it fades out. Let's set this to something like 3 seconds, which will be 3000 milliseconds. Another thing that we need to do is, the moment this task is done, we also want the image gallery on the front end page to update and load the new file, or basically re-render the entire file. To do that, we will also emit another event called do update, and this basically won't contain any data, so just an empty bracket over here. So all said and done, now delete the local file. So how do we delete the local file? We'll say fs.unlink and provide the complete path to the file, which will be basically n file, and that's about it. So just you can provide a callback function which just says local file deleted. Alright, so once this is done, I would shift the focus to the index.html page for a second, because we have created two events here, two socket events, and we need to receive them in the index.html. So let's create our event listeners over here. So the first thing that we'll do is we will include socket.io on this page, which we can do over here by doing a script source /socket.io /socket.io.js. So this will call in the client side library for socket.js. Next, I need to create a variable called socket and set it to IO, and in the bracket we will provide the host. Then we will create an event listener called socket.on, and we are listening for an event called status. And when the status event is invoked, simply take the data packet and run the show status function, which we have in the photogrid_utils, and provide with the data.message and the data.delay. So the data object in this case contains two attributes: the message, which you want to display on the page, and the delay, the number of milliseconds for which the message should be visible on the page. So that's what will actually display the message on the page. And another thing that we need to do is we need to listen for the do update event, and when that occurs, simply run a function called render list. So the render list function will essentially load in all the files from the S3 bucket and will show the files on the page as a gallery. We will build this function and the necessary routes in the next video.